industry presenting, you'll have very similar topics, and you'll see that the data is so different on the same topic, right? So this is so let's start looking at some of the healthcare challenges in the world globally, and some of it is also applicable to the APAC region as well. I think the first challenge for all the regions globally, whether they are developing countries or developed countries, is really about is the economics of healthcare, because the budgets are unsustainable for any public sector or public healthcare authorities to be able to fund. We see that largely even in the US, Japan, it's so difficult to sustain those sort of budgets. You look at some of these emerging countries in Southeast Asia, all of them have universal healthcare. But I think the challenge is keeping the universal healthcare going, and funding again becomes a huge issue when it comes to universal healthcare. So I think that's one of the critical challenges for any country, whether it's a developed country or a developing country. We're also talking about treatment decisions, gap in accuracy. I think Kevin alluded to that from IBM Watson standpoint. How does digital platforms or digital technology sort of help that bridge the gap in terms of accuracy of treatment? We're talking about evidence-based care, right, or evidence-based medicine. Again, looking at how do you use the data that is available to provide more specific precision medicine or personalized medicine, as we call it. I don't have to talk about aging population again, the silver tsunami that was being spoken about, so I'm not going to touch upon that too much. The other aspect is also value-based outcomes, and that's something that Kevin touched upon in his last slide, which is really looking about healthcare spending, which is really has a disconnect with the outcomes, which means that today the insurance companies actually incentivize patients to get into a clinic in the hospital, right? And they incentivize the doctors to look or to consult the patients every time. It's not based on the outcomes of the patient. So I think the shift is happening, but it's a slow shift. Less than 10% of the global healthcare spend happens on value-based outcomes. The rest of it is fee-for-service. Even in the US, where it started, it's still yet to catch up when we talk about value-based care, when we talk about bundle payments for value-based care. So that's the state of the industry today in terms of some of the challenges that we look at when we speak about the healthcare space. I think one of the shifts that's happened as well is largely all of these challenges, although they will not go away, but they are being resolved, or there are some solutions that technology brings to the table. And when we look at data, when we look at machine learning, it helps optimize, it helps bring in a lot of efficiency into the healthcare system. And that's where you look at, whether it's from an economic standpoint, you're able to bring in a bit more efficiency, you're able to bring in outcomes, so you're able to pay for the outcomes, you're able to provide evidence-based care. So all of these is really enabled today by technology. And that technology uses a lot of data, and that data is generated from people sitting here, right? Everyone uses smart watches, smart wearables. You get into a hospital, there's a lot of data that's created. So I think the data is the core or the heart of the transformation that's happening in the healthcare space. This is one of my favorite slides, because this is really what's happening in the healthcare industry globally. We still talk about healthcare. We are talking about treatment as one of the key areas of focus for healthcare companies, whether they are medical device companies, pharma companies, service providers. But the big shift that's happening in the industry today is largely moving from the treatment part to more a preventive health sort of an area, which means that everyone is looking at health and wellness than actually the treatment. So if you look at if you look at some of the spend that's happening, you'll see that the treatment part of it has or takes 70%, or used to take 70% of the healthcare spend in 2007. And as you look towards 2025, you'll see that that percentage of the healthcare spend is shrinking, right? Why? Because everyone is looking at more prevention and diagnosis than actually the treatment part of it. So there are a couple of trends that are driving this trend, which is moving towards more prevention and diagnosis than actually the treatment part. One is really the consumerization mindset shift itself, because everyone's now shifting towards being more aware of their health and moving towards more health and balance. Pharma companies know that they cannot make more money by selling more drugs. They need to be looking at how do they help the patients really diagnose and prevent, than actually start looking at only the treatment part. So the whole industry is, the consumer base or the patient base in the industry is really moving from just looking at the treatment part to really looking at how do we manage our health. And it's not about end of life, sort of treatment or end of life management. It's really about, moving much ahead, and the initial stages itself, ensuring that there is a good, healthy lifestyle all through. An interesting slide. If you look at one of the other big trends and the shift that's happening in the industry today is what we call as the GAFA revolution. Right? And what does GAFA mean? GAFA is the Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. Right? So you look at today, the healthcare industry is no more. It's still dominated by the traditional healthcare guys, but you'll see that it's opening up, or a lot of new entrants in the market today is all technology companies. You look at IBM. IBM is a technology company, but it's made an entry, a big entry into this. So all the healthcare providers have to be quite wary about some of these players in the market, because these players own a huge consumer base, which means that they're a potential patient base for these companies. You'll see that Google already has, partnerships with a lot of companies in the healthcare space, and they develop products. They are a technology company, right? But at the end of the day, they are operating in healthcare as well. How do you classify Amazon? When someone asks us, how do you classify Amazon? Which industry do you classify Amazon? There is no industry in which we can classify Amazon, right? Amazon started off as a retailer, right? But today, I don't know how many of you know, they have a platform for selling medical devices. May not be the high-end medical devices, but these are more consumables, sort of things, more patient or consumer oriented, right? So it will not take long before Amazon can actually start using its Amazon Prime and saying that we provide a doctor on call along with your Amazon Prime service, right? So these companies can really become, or really topple some of the heavyweights in the industry and become the leader in the healthcare space. Similarly, you look at Apple. Apple started off with a watch which was more consumer watch, but today it's got an approval, a marketing approval for its watch from a arrhythmia monitor as an arrhythmia monitoring device. Right? So these companies' strength is a large consumer base, and that's the shift that's happening, which is looking at what we are looking at is a software as a medical device. Right? It's no more. Medical device is no more a physical device, but software is being used as a medical device, and that's the mind shift that everyone needs to look at. That's the shift that's happening. So I think that sets the sort of a large sort of terms of some of the shifts happening in the healthcare space, and I think this is something that is not just for the developed countries, but it's also slowly started moving into the developing countries as well. What I'm going to cover is looking at some of the implications of what we've talked about, but also in terms of what are some of the other shifts that are happening in the medical device space in the Asia Pacific region. Okay. This is one of the areas that we sort of specialize in, and what we believe today is industries today are coming up with new innovations, new ways of operating, and a revolution is happening across industries because there is convergence happening between technology and industries, and that's really giving rise to a lot of new opportunities for players across. If you look at what is driving the healthcare space as well, and we spoke about a lot about the digital revolution or the digital transformation, the sensor technology today has become so ubiquitous, which means that it's penetrated so much that you'll find a sensor in almost every device, and those sensors can really monitor your vital parameters. It could be your watch, it could be any other embedded or what you call as a connected medical device that uses sensors. Why? Because the cost of sensors has gone so low and the technology has improved so much that you can pack in a lot more, multiple functionalities within a specific semiconductor or a chip that has multiple sensors. So a sensor technology with a medical device industry or healthcare industry brings up new opportunities. When you're looking at, let's say, data analytics, and let's look at imaging as an industry, as a healthcare space or a healthcare industry, you'll see that there's so much of opportunity, and AI in imaging is one of the leading spaces for a lot of companies. And that's an area where AI, artificial intelligence, has penetrated a lot in terms of healthcare. So we find, or we believe, that the cusp of technology in the industry brings in a lot more opportunities, and that's what is driving also a lot of things that's happening in the healthcare space, specifically in the medical device space. Just a quick look in terms of how do the numbers sort of stack up in the medical device industry. In Asia Pacific, the number was at around $95 billion, or very close to $96 billion. In 2018, you'll see it going to around 99 or $100 billion in 2019, that's this year. So that's the sort of shift that we're seeing. And medical devices, as compared to a pharma industry, right, the healthcare industry grows anywhere between 4 to 5% or 4 to 6% globally. But you'll see that the medical device industry is growing much faster, or will grow much faster as compared to the pharma or any other industry. How does it break up in terms of some of the segments within the medical device space? You see that some of the areas that traditionally have been an area for a lot of consumption of medical devices, ortho is one of the major areas which is driving the use of medical devices. Cardio or cardiac area is again one of the areas for driving medical devices that takes a larger chunk in the overall space. Minimally invasive surgery, devices that are used today for minimally invasive surgery, I think that's catching up a lot, also because there's a lot of reimbursement that's happening today for daycare surgeries, right? So as that sort of kicks in, you'll see a lot of minimally invasive surgery technologies coming into play, and that's taking up, or that's driving the industry. The others are wound care. Respiratory is another interesting area because because people think that respiratory is just one sort of an indication. There are a lot of other indications that lead to respiratory issues, and you could talk about sleep, you could talk about a lot of other things that lead to respiratory issues, or you could look at even respiratory issues to track other diseases. So I think that's one area that's gaining a lot of traction in the Asia Pacific region. Okay, so let's look at what are the 5 themes, and this is something that we do every year. We refresh this study every year, and this study we go to all the leading global companies, we speak to some of the regional companies, and then we identify the top 5 themes that drive this industry now and in the near future. The first trend, or the first theme that's driving the industry today is what we call as, and we spoke about this a bit, which is called as software as a medical device. So this is what we think is going to drive the medical industry space, or the medical industry in Asia Pacific. And when we talk about software as a medical device, we just don't look at an app on your mobile phones or in your tablet, but it's also about connected medical devices. We're looking at distribution and channel optimization. And there's a huge shift today happening in terms of how the distribution channels are being used, because distribution channels bring in a lot of cost on your sales and administrative expenses. So how do you sort of control that as well, and how do you bring in a lot more effectiveness into that? That's one of the themes that we've seen, and a lot of companies are worried about the distribution strategy, right? And we spoke about Amazon as well. And and there is a lot of breakthrough that's happening on online distribution, and that's something that we will talk about in a minute. We talk about an interesting phenomenon called value products. And this is very specific to largely the Southeast Asia sort of region or set of countries. We talk about India and China as well. I think a lot of the global companies are struggling because they're not able to, they're bringing in products that are designed for the global markets into this region. Whereas the private hospitals can probably afford to use those expensive equipments, but there is a huge space or an opportunity or a dormant opportunity that is there within the Asia Pacific region that is being tapped by some of the companies in China, India, Korea, which are really bringing in what we call as value products. So value products is becoming the value is becoming the premium, in terms of medical device. We're talking about reimbursement. Let's speak a little bit about how reimbursement is driving the medical device industry. What does it mean, for medical devices? Then the last one is obviously to look at how can medical device companies own the care continuum, which means that it's, again, we're talking about just not the treatment part of it. How does, and everyone is trying to get that piece of the market. Pharma companies are saying, hey, how do I own the patient, right from diagnosis to treatment to post-treatment? Medical device companies are thinking, how do I own them? How do I own a patient from the diagnostic phase to a treatment to a monitoring phase? So everyone's trying to now own the care continuum, because once you own the value chain, you're able to control, you're able to extract value from that sort of value chain. So these are the 5 big themes that we have identified through our research. I'll go a bit deeper into each of these themes, and then see how does this sort of pan out for the medical device industry in the Asia Pacific. Some of these are very heavy slides, so bear with me. If you look at software as a medical device, I think one of the key drivers of this has been what we call as connected medical devices. And what does a connected medical device mean? That any device which is clinically approved, which is used either by a patient or a consumer, or even in hospitals, which can collect data or which can monitor a patient or a consumer's health and can transfer data, is called as a connected medical device. So we see the connected medical device industry or the segment to grow from $1.5 billion to almost like $4 billion. Why? Because it really brings down it brings down the cost of monitoring a patient, the cost of really getting data in terms of what the patient is going through or what a consumer is going through. And how does this look like in terms of the share in the global market? Asia Pacific is going to go from 7% to almost like 13% in the global connected device market. Not a big number, but we also have to realize that as a region, we still struggle for access for healthcare, right? So I think that's one of the key challenges that we have, and it's just starting to pick up, and that's where we see it going from 7 to 13%. What are some of the disease areas that are driving the connected device area or the medical device area? Very clearly, cardiology and diabetes are 2 key areas. We spoke about sugar IQ. That's what was presented by Kevin, from IBM standpoint. Very clearly, you look at it, diabetes is one of the most chronic diseases across the globe. And that's an area where there are a number of companies in that space, but there is still innovation being created. The reason is that the ability to be able to bring in that efficacy in terms of diagnosis and treatment is extremely critical. Right? Because you can have tons of these sugar or blood glucose measuring devices, you could have tons of these applications, but how accurately can they predict, how accurately can they suggest what a patient should do, I think is very important. Cardiology is another area, and another chronic disease. So that's another area where a lot of companies are looking at how do they bring in small sensor-based sort of devices. How can they bring in a lot more of gathering of data on your apps? How do you pull in data analytics or an AI layer along with the applications to be able to look at what are the recommendations that a device can provide, right? And this can be shared again once the app gets data. You're able to share it with your physicians. You're able to again go back and meet the physicians if it requires. And some of it is also being driven today by a lot of the reimbursement that's happening in the space. And we know that in Asia Pacific, especially in the Southeast Asia region, there's not much that's happening from a regulatory standpoint. But some of these areas are for countries like Singapore, probably even Malaysia. You'll see that these are all still put in the sandbox, regulatory sandbox, which means that they're being tested. But once these are approved, clinically approved, and these are regulated, FDA approved, then you'll see that these will become the mainstream in terms of diagnostic treatment. Some of the companies that should look out for, you have all the names out there. Roche, you talk about Medtronic, you talk about AliveCore, Omron, all the names are out there. So largely, cardiology and diabetes are two key areas. We're looking at gynec and respiratory as the next in line growth, specifically from a connected device. So another quick slide on how the connected medical device is really helping move the whole, or make the shift from what we call as a hospital-centric or a clinic-centric healthcare, more patient-centric healthcare. So what this does is really, it helps the healthcare service providers to provide healthcare services to people where they are and at their place. The healthcare service is provided at the place at which they are. So you see a lot of products that are wearable, handheld devices. A lot of clinicians or physicians today use a lot of point of care terminals or testing devices as well. And these are again connected devices in a way. Self-monitoring devices, and large part of it is also home care devices, which means that you can really have an ICU setting at your home, not really being in an ICU in a hospital. Why? Because it costs so much for a hospital to keep a patient in an ICU. The first hospital is to ensure that the beds are sort of rotated on a regular basis after a certain period of time, so that the patients, the required, the ICU patients, those who require that sort of attention are really put into that. And others are from a long-term acute care standpoint, they are really shifted on to a place where either their home or a nursing home where they can be taken care of from a long-term perspective. How can you do that? A connected medical device really helps you do that, because you can measure, you can set up the same sort of an ICU environment that is in a hospital. And what you do, you really have nurses, doctors monitor patients, be able to take some action for the patients when things are not going. So something that's driving this connected medical device is really what we call as digitalization of healthcare. So there are three parts to this. The first one is what we call as cloud computing. And the reason is we know that a lot of the hospitals today, a lot of the service providers have all their data on cloud platforms. Why? Because it's so much more expensive to store data physically. So it's all there in the cloud, which is a shared sort of data shared space. That's really driving. So you'll see that in Asia Pacific, 90% of the hospitals are planning to invest around $400 billion in cloud technologies. This is pretty prevalent probably in the US, but in Asia Pacific, this is still an opportunity area where hospitals can still invest in cloud technology. So any companies that are any vendor, any company that is into this space has a large role to play in this. Talking about Internet of Things, again, everything is sensor-based, sensor-driven, and that's what we call as Internet of Things. So you'll see that the overall market, will grow by almost like 30%, and it's expected to reach up to 11 billion by 2024. And that's a huge shift that's happening, and that includes all the type of devices, including what we wear today as a wearable device is an IoT based device. So what happens when you have a cloud data, when you have data, or when you have wearables that or IoT wearable that we all use, or a connected device we use, we generate a lot of data. So what do you do with the data? You start analyzing the data. So today, even hospitals, who are not analyzing the data, are going to invest in analyzing the data. The reason is that hospitals that invest in these technologies, patients really move towards those hospitals. And because why? They're able to predict, they're able to be ready and bring in a better patient experience when you have analyzed the patient's records, the patient data, to be able to surprise the patient by saying that you know everything about them, you're able to do some analysis using various platforms. So that's an area of high growth where we're talking about 52% of the hospitals investing quite a big sum in the next 3 to 4 years. So we talk about, so this is the second theme, and this is important because other than software as a medical device where you really don't have to use a physical distribution or a distributor to distribute devices, a lot of the devices still, whether it's used by hospitals, clinics, or any diagnostic center, you still have physical devices, and you still need to reach and penetrate into the market. You still need distribution channels. So this is a huge cost for a lot of companies when it comes to the distribution channels. They have to manage the distributors. They need to have a sales force that manages the distributors. So what do? You expand your distribution base, you optimize your distributors. How do you ensure that they are legally following your processes? There are a lot of challenges to look at when you to manage the distribution channel. So I think the important part here is, as companies strive to make margins on their devices, it's extremely critical to keep your sales, and administrative costs under control and your distribution costs under control. So the shifts that's happening in this market is, you'll see that from 20% in direct sales, it's going to go to 40% by the year 2023. And that's a huge shift that's happening in terms of what we're talking about, the distribution channel. Why? Because there are companies that are looking at setting up pure key accounts to be able to address the requirements of big hospitals, big service providers. No more distributors will be used to do that because they have their own channels to be able to provide services to them. Why? We also see that there's a lot of there's going to be an online sales channel that is that's going to come into play for a lot of the consumables part. Today, even consumables are being sold to distributors, but you'll see that because these products are quite mature in terms of technology, from criteria or margin is a key criteria, you can't have really huge sales force selling that product. You've got to be optimizing it, you've got to be selling it on a platform. Why? Because you don't really need a salesperson or a field application engineer to explain the product. It's a standard product. In terms of end users, you'll see that the home users, which means that people who are at home, they also become a consumer or they become a customer for a lot of the medical device companies. That's where you'll also see, that's why the online channel also becomes extremely important. Where's the consolidation happening? The consolidation in terms of distribution channels is happening for products which are largely, high-tech patient monitoring sort of devices. Still smaller piece of devices that can still move on to, being a direct sales channel. You can look at some of the high-tech consumables that are there that can move in more into the online sort of channels. So there are a set of segments or a set of product segments or areas that can move on to becoming, online sort of a channel or adopting more direct sales channel. So distribution setup is going to change in the next few years in the Asia Pacific medical device industry. This is one of the interesting themes that we have found, although this has been as part of the industry for quite some time. But this started off in China and India, primarily by companies like GE and Philips, which actually started developing products for the market. One of the challenges in the medical device space has been, especially which has been dominated by the global players, has been that it's a product that it's a one-size-fits-all product, which means that you design these products in the US or in Europe, wherever the company is, and you bring those products into the Asian market. So you have the same products with the same features and the same technology, but the scenarios or the marketplace is completely different in terms of the ability to spend the budgets. I think the second part of it is also in terms of the people who operate these devices. Many equipments, you don't have people who are well trained, and especially in remote areas, especially when you don't have power to run some of these machines. So how do you look at equipments or devices that are designed for specific markets? Right? And I think there are two companies that have done it really well. GE has been a pioneer in the space. They have a huge research and development team in India, in China, and that's where they started developing products for those markets specifically. So I think many of us confuse value products to be products that are much cheaper. Yes, definitely they are lesser in cost, but they don't come with the same features. They are not the same they are not the same products that are designed in the US and sold at a lower cost in these markets. And I think that's the mistake that a lot of global companies do, because I think they are trying to think in terms of saying, okay, I have a product which is maybe 2 versions lower, I sell it at a lower price. Maybe that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at value products is that you design a product for that market with the features that are required to be able to suit those market requirements. And I think that's a value product. And some of the companies that are Chinese, you find that a lot of Chinese companies have made a lot of headway into this space, and they actually have captured, and that's also true for US, where the budgets are less, where some of these companies have been able to take share away from some of the larger companies in the US. Right? And Mindray is one of the examples that we always take when it comes to a value product company, where it designs products required for those markets, sell it at a price. You'll see that that this market is going to go from 10.8 to 26 billion dollars, in 2023, and that's a huge shift. That's a big shift. So this is a market that is not readily available in the sense it's not already created. It's a small market, but I think companies have to make an effort to be able to get or take a share in this market. It's not a market that is readily available for someone to just go and sell an existing product. They need to create products, design products, create plans, even to the extent that you need to have a separate distribution strategy and a service strategy. Share of the value segment in medical device, it's going to go from 12% to 19%. So that's the shift. So it's going to gain 7% in the next few years in the Asia Pacific market. Some of the companies that you can look at, I mentioned about Mindray and GE. Philips also has been one of the companies that have designed products for specific markets, whether it's a smaller product, less energy intensive sort of products. So Philips has been a pioneer in that. There are some other companies that we have mentioned here. Some of the companies like Medtronic and others are trying to get into this space, but largely you'll see that there are not many global companies. Means that these are more regional companies, more companies that are coming out of emerging nations. Another slide on some of the countries that are potential from a value segment perspective or a value product perspective. You'll find that Indonesia is one of the countries that is again driven by universal healthcare. They have a system where largely the products are also purchased. It's quite transparent in terms of their purchases. The price is very transparent. So Indonesia is a market which is looking at, or which has a requirement or a need, I would say, for value-based products. Provided there are certain conditions, if you manufacture it locally, then you'll find that a lot of it is accepted by the public hospitals or the public healthcare providers, which means there's a huge market that will drive volumes. We're looking at Philippines, we're looking at, obviously Malaysia is a market, Vietnam is a market. China and India are markets that are already big, and there are local players driving this market. So China and India are high growth markets from a value product standpoint. But what we're looking at as the next set of markets are Indonesia, we're looking Vietnam, we're looking at Malaysia. Some of the markets that are probably not very conducive for value products are, you look at Singapore, a smaller market, people have, the patience or the government has the ability to fund. Japan doesn't recognize a value product because I think when we talk about value product, it certainly has a question of quality. So I think for Japanese customers or Japanese companies, I think that's the perception issue which is there. So hence, the market doesn't really believe in what a value product. So this is how the regional stack up is in terms of opportunities for companies in terms of value. Looking at reimbursement as the new driver, what we are seeing is that a lot of the consumption in medical devices also happens because there's a reimbursement for these medical devices. And when you talk about any type of medical device, even whether you talk about a connected medical device, you talk about software as a medical device, and you really don't have to have a physical medical device. All these are also based on the reimbursement of the products. The more the reimbursement, the higher the acceptance or higher the penetration of these products. So reimbursement plays a very important role, and we see that there's 15% increase in share of reimbursement for medical devices in the next 5 years, which means that there is an opportunity for medical device players to look at it from a reimbursement perspective. It's going to grow from the share of value products specifically because the value products is something which is affordable. There's reimbursement that can happen, especially when it comes to the consumer or the patient-oriented sort of product. You'll see that the share of value products is really going to go from 80 to 60% as part of that reimbursement pool. Some of the areas, again, we're talking about areas like cardiology, diabetes, respiratory. Oncology is a long cycle of care. That's going to be a bit more challenging. But again, diabetes, cardiac, these are some of the areas that can that will get reimbursement. Because obviously it's slightly expensive, but it's also a very chronic disease. Oncology becomes very expensive for the public health authorities at this point in time without a clear efficacy or clear clinical outcomes being shown. It's difficult for reimbursement in that phase than the traditional sort of treatment. Looking at one more slide on the changes in reimbursement, you'll see that from a standpoint of looking at public versus private in terms of the insurance mix, and that's going to shift quite a bit. That the public insurance will still grow because there's the universal healthcare, but we also see that along with the universal healthcare, because there is a segment that a middle class segment which is moving into upper middle class segment, which has more affordability to invest in private insurance. There is always a private insurance angle that comes in, and that's the part that's going to grow in the next few years when you talk about insurance or reimbursement. As part of reimbursement, we're talking about value products increasing dramatically because that's the need of the hour from almost all the markets within Asia, specifically the South Asia like India, and then you look at China as well. In terms of products, there is an element of the wellness part as well, and as the consumer mindset shifts, as the public authorities mindset also shifts from just the treatment part to more prevention, I think the wellness part also gets a lot of attention in terms of reimbursement. You'll see that in Singapore, all the citizens have been given wearables for them to be able to monitor their health from a wellness standpoint. That data gets collected by the government. So there's a lot that can happen when the government reimbursement is there for some of these areas. The last theme that we talk about, owning the patient care continuum. So we used to look at product-centric business models, which means that I sell a product and that's the end of it. I sell a product to a hospital, I sell a product to a consumer, but that's the end of the story. Right? How do I extend my partnership with a patient or a customer or a client? Was not existent at all. But what we are talking about today is really designing services around the product. and we talk about Uberization of healthcare. We talk about product as a service model coming into healthcare. So no more are products being sold. I mean, in countries like Malaysia, if you look at it, the blood glucose monitor are given free to the patients, although the government funds for it. But I think the message here is that companies have to start looking at providing a portfolio, a bouquet of services around the product. It's about designing that care continuum right from the starting phase, which is really talking to the patient or the consumer even when they are well, not only when they are sick. Right? You're talking to a patient or a consumer when they are even healthy, not when they are sick. So the journey starts from there. Some of the areas that you could look at, cardiology, diabetes, again, at the top end of the right-hand corner in terms of the quadrant, you'll see that respiratory devices. Respiratory is an area where you can own the care continuum. You have other areas like gynec, oncology. Neurology is a bit difficult. You'll find that there's not been much progress made there. There are a lot of companies trying to get that area. Neurology probably will get into a stage where oncology is today after maybe 5 to 7 years down the line. So if you look at this opportunities for OEMs, it's really about looking at some of these disease areas and saying, how do I own the patient? How do I own the care continuum? And not just look at selling a product just maybe for diagnostic or just for treatment or maybe just for monitoring, but it's really about owning the patient all throughout the care continuum. Okay, a lot of opportunities for medical device companies, but at the same time, we also find that there are a lot of challenges for the medical device companies. A busy slide. We have so many startups across the globe. We have umpteen number of startups, and we have a lot of technology companies entering, the space. Just in India, the place that probably I belong to, which is Bangalore, every nook and corner, it's become a cottage industry, what we call as a cottage industry. A healthcare startup or a healthcare company with a technology platform has become a cottage industry. Right? Why? Because the backbone is technology. Right? But I think the challenge is scalability. How do you scale the business? It starts as a hobby, but how do you make it as a real business? I think that's a big challenge. And that's why you'll see that a lot of these bigger companies that own a consumer base are really able to scale it because they already have a consumer base. And that's where a lot of these startups also think about selling themselves or exiting themselves after a certain time once they sort of develop the product into a certain phase where it can get into commercialization. We spoke about Google, Apple, Facebook, GAFA invasion. M is Microsoft here, so I'm not going to go through that again. The other aspect is growth of domestic manufacturing. So I think that's an important part. So some of the countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, who have regulated, who have eased their regulations from a domestic manufacturing standpoint, and also because we're talking about value products. If products are designed for those markets, and if you want to keep the cost low, companies have to start manufacturing within those countries. Right? So that's the sort of challenge that companies have, and you also have to start looking at your supply chain, all of that when you start looking at domestic manufacturing. You're looking at changing device ecosystem. We spoke about it, but I think the challenge is how do you ensure that people adopt those software as a medical device, and unless the reimbursement part kicks in, it's difficult for that penetration. We are talking about horizontal expansion. Any company, any healthcare service provider that you talk about is trying to bring the cost down. They're trying to make processes more efficient. And what's happening because of that? They're trying to acquire companies. They are trying to acquire platform companies. They're trying to acquire companies, consulting companies, which can help them, improve their processes over a period of time. Insurance out-of-pocket impact long-term adherence. I think adherence is one of the critical factors in the healthcare space. Only because there is no adherence, I think a lot of companies don't make money. I think that's a critical part. So as insurance models and the reimbursement models really have to change that part of it, which means that they have to start looking at how do you ensure that patients adhere to their regimen, right? How do they adhere to the whole treatment phase itself to be able to ensure that there is no readmissions happening into the hospital. Lack of innovation in the conventional segment. Some of the segments within the healthcare space have remained very traditional. Right? One of the areas is stents. Stents has become so traditional. There's no innovation happening. Even if you look at some of the imaging sort of industries, it's just gone from a large, big, probably ultrasound to probably a pocket ultrasound scanner. Right? Beyond that, nothing has changed. But what's changed there is probably the innovation in terms of data analytics, how we use data that's captured from some of these devices. So I think that's another area which is not, but there's an opportunity for companies to be able to innovate in that space where some of these devices have remained very traditional. So these are some of the challenges. So having looked at what are the opportunities, what are the challenges in the industry, I think the hope is that the H in the healthcare really moves from what we call as the hope. I think the past was really the hope, in the sense that everyone used to hope that they get healthcare access, right? They get better healthcare. In some ways today it's a hype as well, because we are talking about artificial intelligence and presenting about connected devices. I think unless you see things happening on the ground, a lot of it can be hype, right? Because the costs are also so high. But I think what we can only hope with all this transformation that's happening in the healthcare industry is really what we talk about humanism. And when you talk about humanism, which means that every individual has the right to get healthcare access at an affordable cost. Right? And that's what we are talking about, or that's what we hope for, where the costs are low from a healthcare access or a healthcare service standpoint. Technology has matured and is really at its high. And we're talking about access also at its high, which means that every individual, no matter where they are, get access to healthcare at the cost, at a very minimal cost that they can. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dinesh, Vice President and Business Head Healthcare, France and Suriname. For the next topic, we are going to talk about Thailand as an industry hub.